It was meant to be a quiet remembrance, a private moment to honor a legacy, but a single, gleaming brooch has ignited a royal inferno. When Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, revealed Queen Elizabeth's personal wish regarding her heirloom, the Windsor walls trembled. This wasn't just about jewelry, it was about power, favoritism, and a secret bond few ever suspected. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The Windsor gathering had all the hallmarks of calm tradition, polite toasts, nostalgic tributes, and veiled discussions about the late Queen's memory. But amid the clinking of cutlery and murmured condolences, Sophie's voice sliced through the atmosphere like ice. In a tone deceptively light, she mentioned that one of the Queen's most prized brooches, an heirloom dripping with legacy and weight, had been left solely to Princess Beatrice. For a moment, the room stood still. Not even the rustling of silk or the shifting of posture could break the silence that followed. It wasn't what she said, it was who she said it about. Beatrice, the soft-spoken royal who had long remained in the margins, was now at the center of a secret the family never expected to be exposed. Beatrice's expression betrayed everything: confusion, disbelief, and something deeper. Across from her, Eugenie looked away, lips pursed as if suppressing 1,000 unsaid words. This wasn't a celebration of inheritance. It was a lightning strike. Queen Elizabeth's brooch was no ordinary token. It had adorned sovereigns in times of war and peace, witnessed the rise and fall of empires, and carried whispers of loyalty, strategy, and succession. Its selection as a bequest was not just symbolic, it was surgical. And Sophie knew it. Camilla's fingers stiffened around her glass, her eyes narrowing not at Sophie but at Charles, who offered no response. Silence clung to the air like smoke. Anne, stoic as ever, simply stared ahead, but even her unflinching gaze could not mask the slight tremor in her hand. The brooch's reveal had not only sparked questions but reopened old wounds, wounds of hierarchy, respect, and maternal favor. Whispers, once only the territory of staff and speculation, now screamed behind palace walls. Had Queen Elizabeth truly seen Beatrice as her quiet successor? Had she, in her final years, placed her hopes in the hands of a granddaughter the world barely noticed? Because the truth was, behind the pomp and pageantry, a different monarchy had been forming in the shadows. Elizabeth, though never one for sentiment, had grown visibly closer to Beatrice. Afternoon teas behind closed doors, shared smiles at public events, and cryptic remarks about new blood with old grace had all been noted but never questioned, until now. With a single sentence, Sophie hadn't just passed on a possession. She detonated a revelation, and with that revelation came consequence. Tensions long dormant surged beneath the surface. The Queen Consort was not amused. The heir to the throne was paralyzed by his own memories, and those who had assumed they were next in line to the Queen's favor now found themselves disoriented in a new order. A brooch had changed everything. But what made this brooch so powerful, so dangerous, that its inheritance could unravel decades of royal hierarchy? To outsiders, it's just an accessory. But within palace walls, every gem tells a story, and this brooch? It whispered of war, betrayal, and ascension. Queen Elizabeth didn't just leave Beatrice jewelry, she left her a legacy written in diamonds and duty. Whispers of the brooch's origin trace back through the labyrinth of royal history, tangled in myth and prestige. Some say it belonged to Queen Victoria herself, a piece commissioned in the shadow of grief, worn as armor through a reign marked by stoicism and sorrow. Others argue it was gifted by Queen Mary, forged during the turbulence of the early 20th century when empires trembled and monarchies fell like dominoes. But whatever its true lineage, one thing was certain. This brooch wasn't just decorative, it was decisive. Known privately within the family as the sovereign's whisper, it was a silent witness to the monarchy's darkest reckonings and most pivotal triumphs. And now, it was in Beatrice's possession, quietly, dangerously so. This wasn't the kind of jewel displayed on magazine covers or paraded at garden parties. This brooch emerged only when power was shifting. It had adorned Elizabeth's shoulder during her wartime broadcasts, when the fate of Britain itself hung in the balance. It gleamed subtly at closed door diplomatic summits, when hands were shaken, and wars were averted not by generals, but by a queen who understood the game better than any man in the room. Even her coronation veil had brushed against it, as if blessing the peace for the burdens it would bear. But there was something else, an unspoken vow whispered from monarch to monarch. The brooch would pass not to the most senior, nor to the most visible, but to the one most like her. The one who carried not just the bloodline, but the burden. In her twilight years, Elizabeth had grown more reflective. Observers noticed how often she glanced toward Beatrice during formal events. A glance that lingered, a subtle nod, a rare smile. To some, it meant nothing. But to those who understood the Queen's language so often spoken without words, it was deafening. Beatrice, with her quiet grace and inner resolve, mirrored the young princess Elizabeth had once been. A girl who never sought the throne but bore it nonetheless. It wasn't about charisma or popularity. It was about resilience, restraint, and quiet fire, the very qualities the Queen had long protected in herself, and perhaps finally saw again in Beatrice. Elizabeth knew what this brooch represented. She understood that with it came the weight of legacy and the isolation of those chosen but not celebrated. In her final days, surrounded by protocol and shadowed by duty, she made her decision, not out of favoritism but foresight, not for sentiment but for survival. And so this whisper of sovereignty, wrapped in velvet and sealed away, waited silently for the day when its true recipient would unknowingly trigger a storm by wearing it. But if Queen Elizabeth saw Beatrice as her spiritual successor, why was the truth hidden until after her death? Why did Sophie know, and why now? For years the Duchess played the quiet royal, the observer, but behind her calm demeanor was knowledge that could destabilize the crown. Her reveal wasn't just spontaneous, it was strategic. Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, had always been perceived as a steady hand, never controversial, never loud. But those closest to Queen Elizabeth knew the quiet ones were often the most trusted. In the Queen's final years, it was Sophie who became her confidant. Not Camilla, not Anne, not even Charles. It was Sophie who walked beside her on cool mornings in Windsor Gardens. Sophie who listened in silence as the monarch spoke in riddles and regrets. Tea between them wasn't ceremony, it was sanctuary. And in those hushed moments, Elizabeth unburdened herself in a way she rarely allowed. She spoke not just of tradition, but of failure, not just of duty, but of disillusionment. She was tired of the noise, the headlines, the disobedience masked as progress. She wanted something else, someone else. Someone who reminded her of what the crown once meant before it became a machine. And that someone, as she often implied with a subtle softness in her voice, was Beatrice. She listens, the Queen had once told Sophie, her tone lined with both pride and pain. She understands what it means to wait, to serve before being seen. In those words, Sophie heard the unmistakable echo of a sovereign choosing her spiritual heir not through bloodline but through understanding. Beatrice, so often overlooked, had left an impression, one that would crystallize into a final symbolic gesture, the brooch. A gift not of glamour, but of guidance. An inheritance not meant for celebration but for safeguarding. But if Sophie knew all this, why did she stay silent for so long? Because even she understood the bomb she carried. To reveal the brooch's intended heir while Elizabeth lived would have risked a silent civil war. Camilla, now Queen Consort, had clawed her way into legitimacy. Anne, stoic and Unyi. Elding would see it as an insult. And Charles, well, Charles was caught in the ever-tightening vice of modern monarchy and maternal memory. Sophie waited, and waited. But waiting too carries its own weight. After the Queen's passing, when grief met power and order met chaos, Sophie found herself in a corner. Rumours swirled, alliances formed, and in a moment that appeared casual but was anything but, she dropped the truth. The Queen had chosen, and her choice was Beatrice. There were those who said Sophie acted out of jealousy, or worse, desperation, that she was positioning herself within a new power structure. But the truth was more complicated. Sophie had seen what silence does to legacies. She'd watched history contort around those who never spoke. And now she was speaking. but the price of truth was steep. Camilla, once an uneasy ally, turned cold. Behind the palace walls, glances grew sharper, words more measured. Sophie's revelation hadn't just opened a chapter, it had redrawn the entire royal map. But Sophie's bombshell didn't just shock, it drew battle lines within the royal family. Camilla didn't speak, but her glare could have shattered glass. In the Queen Consort's eyes, this was not just disrespect, it was rebellion. And Charles? He stayed quiet. But that silence, it spoke volumes. From the moment Sophie uttered the Queen's final wish, the air around Camilla changed. Frost replaced formality. Every glance she cast across the table felt like a warning wrapped in velvet. To her, this wasn't just about a brooch, it was a betrayal of the monarchy's new order. Elizabeth was gone. The torch had passed. Or so she believed. But now, with this symbolic jewel quietly bestowed upon Beatrice, the past had clawed its way into the present. In Camilla's world, where status had been fought for, not gifted, Sophie's announcement was more than inconvenient. It was incendiary. Behind closed doors, insiders spoke of a confrontation, Camilla, cornering Sophie in a corridor thick with tension. Words weren't shouted, they were whispered, sharp as razors. Camilla allegedly accused her of disrupting the monarchy's fragile unity, of dragging ghosts into a throne room that no longer belonged to them. Sophie, it said, held her ground, her expression unreadable. But no one left that exchange unchanged, least of all Charles, who had overheard just enough to understand what this moment demanded: diplomacy, silence, and calculation. For Charles, the bequest reopened an uncomfortable truth that his mother had never fully let go. Elizabeth's gift to Beatrice wasn't just a nod of affection, it was a coded message. Camilla had never worn the brooch, not once, and while that fact had long been dismissed as coincidence, it now burned with purpose. What did it mean exactly for the Queen to bypass her daughter-in-law? To leave behind not a throne, but a symbol of royal sovereignty to a granddaughter with no formal claim to power? It was a question Charles could not answer, at least not without unraveling the delicate image he'd spent decades rebuilding. And so he remained still, a statue caught between eras. On one side, the shadow of his mother, unyielding in her traditions, meticulous in her signals. On the other, his wife, whose legitimacy had cost the royal family so much public goodwill and private compromise. The silence he offered wasn't indifference, it was paralysis. Because acknowledging the brooch as anything more than a trinket would set off a chain of recognition he wasn't prepared to confront. Not now, maybe not ever. Yet Camilla didn't need words to read the room. The Queen's absence had left space, and Sophie had filled it with memory and meaning. Worse, Beatrice, once a peripheral figure, was suddenly recast in a new light. Camilla, who had spent years asserting her place in the palace, saw a younger woman gathering the very support she'd once fought tooth and nail to secure. Her frustration turned surgical. Questions were floated behind curtains and within inner circles. Was Beatrice truly loyal to the new monarchy? Was she prepared for the weight that came with legacy? Or was she another romantic relic from a past the palace needed to forget? But in truth, it wasn't just about Beatrice. This moment cracked open something deeper, something buried beneath decades of protocol. It exposed the fracture lines between two monarchies, the one Elizabeth ruled with iron grace, and the one Charles now leads with uncertain hands. It questioned legitimacy, not in law, but in spirit. And it reminded the entire royal family that no crown is ever truly passed. It is either earned, seized, or left behind for someone bold enough to claim it. But while Camilla seethed and Charles stalled, a younger generation saw an opportunity for power or for collapse. She never asked for a crown. But in that moment, with the weight of a monarch's brooch in her hand, Beatrice understood she had been chosen, and not everyone was pleased. The room still hadn't recovered from Sophie's revelation, but Beatrice's mind had already leapt far ahead. Her fingers, trembling slightly, had traced the brooch's cold edge, the diamonds catching not just the light, but expectation. She hadn't known it was coming. Not like this. Not from Sophie's lips. Not in front of those who still saw her as ornamental, as quiet as background. But now, every glance toward her carried new meaning, some heavy with suspicion. others sharp with envy. What Sophie had revealed wasn't just a bequest, it was a proclamation. And Beatrice, whether she liked it or not, was now standing at the intersection of memory and monarchy. In the hours that followed, she couldn't help but rel. Moments she'd once dismissed as affectionate routine. The Queen inviting her to walk alone in Balmoral Gardens, often in silence. The stories always laced with coded wisdom. The rare letters she'd received private, handwritten, signed not as sovereign, but simply as Granny. They had never spoken directly about legacy, but now, she realized, everything had been a preparation, a quiet moulding. The late Queen hadn't needed to spell it out. She had trained Beatrice in the most traditional royal fashion by quiet example. And now, that burden had crystallized into a brooch, shimmering with the ghost of purpose. Her husband, Edoardo, watched cautiously as the press began circling, sensing something new in Beatrice's air. A shift. They had always preferred their life to be simple out of the tabloids, out of the headlines. But simplicity no longer suited the narrative. Suddenly, Beatrice was being mentioned in think pieces, a possible stabilizer, they said, a new royal face for a weary institution. Offers to step in for public engagements quietly emerged from corners of the palace that had never acknowledged her before. It was subtle at first, an invitation here, a suggestion there, but the message was clear, someone had plans for her, and the brooch was their permission slip. But not all family welcomed this shift. Eugenie, once her closest confidant, began pulling back. Conversations that had once flowed freely now felt rehearsed. There were no accusations, no confrontations, just space, a creeping sense of replacement that Eugenie couldn't voice but couldn't ignore. Beatrice could feel it too, and it broke her in ways the public would never see. Because while the crown may carry power, it often costs you your kin. As the weeks passed, Beatrice's internal conflict deepened. She hadn't sought this, but walking away now would be seen as weakness, disrespect even. Every time she looked at the brooch, now safely kept in a guarded drawer, she didn't see jewelry. She saw responsibility, a call to something greater. The Queen had trusted her, not for ambition, not for charisma, but for her quiet strength, and that trust, it could not be discarded. And as Beatrice grappled with her new role, old rivalries reignited, some dating back decades. Princess Anne, the woman who served, never complained and never expected reward. To her, the brooch's reassignment was more than shocking, it was insulting, and she didn't hold back. For over 70 years, Anne had worn the crown's burdens without seeking its spotlight. She rode beside soldiers, cut ribbons in rainstorms, and stood shoulder to shoulder with her mother in silence and sacrifice. Duty wasn't a performance, it was the air she breathed. And yet, when the Queen's most intimate heirloom passed not to her, but to Beatrice, Anne felt something she rarely let surface: betrayal. She hadn't asked for the brooch, but she had expected its meaning to be respected. And in that moment, it wasn't the object that wounded her, it was the message. A lifetime of discipline had been bypassed by a whisper of legacy. Anne's loyalty, once her greatest currency, now felt spent. Within days of Sophie's revelation, word leaked of Anne's thinly veiled fury. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't storm out, she didn't need to. Those closest to the situation reported a private conversation, clipped and calculated, where Anne allegedly confronted Sophie with an almost surgical tone. "Timing matters," she reportedly said, "and you chose chaos." Sophie, already navigating frost from Camilla, now faced Anne's disappointment, a far colder storm. But Anne didn't stop there. In a meeting with Charles, barely audible to aides behind heavy doors, she is said to have delivered a chilling phrase: "Legacy is earned, not gifted." No one dared ask what he said in return. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps that silence said it all. Beneath Anne's composed rage was something deeper, something raw. She had spent decades being the backbone of the crown, never seeking affection or favor, only stability. Yet in one gesture, her mother had placed a new torch in the hands of someone else. And that torch, whether symbolic or not, flickered with the weight of Anne's own sacrifices. Long before Camilla, Long before Kate, it was Anne who held the monarchy steady while others wavered. And now, as Beatrice stood unknowingly on terrain Anne had long prepared, old wounds reopened not just within Anne, but across the palace. Because if service wasn't honoured, then what was it all for? Whispers began to stir among the staff, many of whom had served under the Queen and Anne both. Their loyalties were complicated, but many could not ignore Anne's decades of unwavering steadiness. In hushed corridors and behind polished doors, quiet support grew for the prince. SS Royal not through rebellion, but reverence. They saw her not as someone who had been overlooked, but someone who had been taken for granted. And perhaps now they feared the monarchy itself was making the same mistake. But no outrage matched the whispers coming from across the Atlantic because, in California, someone else was watching. When Meghan Markle heard about the brooch, insiders say she smiled, but it wasn't joy. For the woman once shunned by the firm, Beatrice's elevation was poetic, and Meghan, never one to waste a moment, began plotting her countermove. To Meghan, the news struck like a well-placed chess move. Beatrice, quiet, obedient, loyal, had suddenly been thrown into the spotlight not by marriage, not by controversy, but by a secret, symbolic endorsement from the Queen herself. And for Meghan, this was more than palace drama. It was a seismic opportunity. After years of being cast as the outsider, the disruptor, the rebel who turned her back on the monarchy, Meghan now saw a subtle crack forming in the walls of the very institution that had tried to shut her out. And in that crack, she saw potential not for revenge, but for reinvention. Sources close to Meghan claim she reached out to Beatrice in the days following Sophie's revelation. A quiet message, possibly just a few lines. Not overtly political, not provocative, but enough to stir speculation. Had the Duchess of Sussex found a surprising new ally within the very family she'd left behind? The idea of a Duchess alliance sent royal commentators into a frenzy. Beatrice, long assumed to be tethered to royal protocol, now stood at a precarious crossroads recognized by the late Queen, alienated by some within the firm, and potentially courted by one of its most divisive figures. The palace, already rattled by the brooch's implications, grew uneasy. Behind the scenes, tension simmered between Beatrice, CE and William. Their dynamic had always been cordial, but the tone had shifted. William, trained to detect threats to the crown's stability, reportedly viewed Meghan's sudden interest in Beatrice as deeply concerning. Questions began swirling. Was Beatrice being groomed for something bigger? Was she being played? Or worse, was she starting to play the game herself? For a monarchy built on hierarchy and control, the emergence of an independent royal figure backed by a former renegade spelled trouble. Serious trouble. Meghan's move wasn't just about Beatrice, it was about rewriting the script. She had been cast out for refusing to conform, punished for refusing to play quiet. But now, someone from within the Queen's own blood had been elevated for the very same quietness she'd rejected. It was a paradox that Meghan understood all too well. And perhaps in Beatrice she saw a chance to challenge the palace from within through influence, not rebellion. Through grace, not grievance. If Beatrice accepted that path, she wouldn't just wear the brooch, she'd wield it. But Meghan wasn't the only one taking notes. In the shadows of Windsor, someone else was orchestrating something even more shocking. Buried in the Queen's private papers, locked away from public eyes, was a codicil, a final amendment to her will that could change everything. And when it surfaced, the royal game reset. The revelation didn't come with trumpets or headlines. It arrived as a whisper, first inside the Balmoral estate, then across hushed palace corridors. A sealed envelope, hand-marked in Elizabeth's unmistakable script, had been found in a lacquered wooden box, tucked away behind decades of diaries and private correspondence. Addressed to Beatrice in full, Her Royal Highness Princess Beatrice of York. It was unopened, untouched, and very much unexpected. No one outside the Queen's tightest circle had known of its existence. But someone, perhaps by design or fate, stumbled upon it during a routine cataloguing of the late monarch's personal effects. And in that moment, the entire trajectory of royal succession was thrown into doubt. The existence of a codicil, an official legal adjustment to a will, wouldn't be unusual for a sovereign who ruled for 70 years. What was unusual was the secrecy surrounding this one. Palace insiders began to murmur that the Queen had left behind more than jewelry and estate instructions. This amendment, they said, contained language that was not only symbolic, but directive. One line allegedly read, "She must be guided, and she must be ready, her time will come sooner than expected." The she, it appeared, was Beatrice. And that single, ambiguous sentence threatened to crack the very foundations of the monarchy's present leadership. The legal implications triggered chaos behind closed doors. Was this codicil merely emotional? Was it ceremonial? Or did it carry the weight of a dying sovereign's final judgment? The Lord Chamberlain's office, legal advisors, and senior courtiers scrambled to interpret its tone without releasing its full content to the public. But word got out. It always does. And suddenly the press, who had begun to treat Beatrice as a passing intrigue, now saw her as a potential disruptor. Headlines turned. The media's lens sharpened. Speculations surged. Was the Queen naming Beatrice for something more? Not a throne, but perhaps a mantle, a figurehead, a bridge between the fractured royal bloodlines. Charles, already bruised by the Brooch revelation, was reportedly furious. The timing, the ambiguity, the mere existence of the letter, all felt like an orchestrated attempt to cast a shadow over his reign before it could fully settle. Rumours swirled that he had instructed advisors to keep the codicil sealed under the guise of protecting the Queen's privacy. But others saw it differently. They called it suppression, a silencing, an echo of what had been done to others before. For Beatrice, the codicil changed everything. The brooch had already placed a target on her back. Now this letter threatened to paint her as an unwilling contender, a reluctant figure placed in the crosshairs of dynastic ambition and institutional paranoia. Suddenly, every step she took, every word she spoke or didn't was dissected. She had become the center of a storm she never summoned, yet couldn't escape, and as the monarchy staggered under secrets, symbolism and suspicion, Sophie herself would face the harshest judgment yet. Sophie thought she was honoring the Queen's memory. Instead, she lit a match that may burn the House of Windsor to its core. And now, as relationships fracture and trust decays, one question echoes through the palace halls: was it worth it? In the days following the Brooch revelation and the codicil's unearthing, Sophie became a symbol herself, not of grace, but of disruption. Where once she had moved through royal circles with quiet poise, now she was met with hesitation, avoidance, and cool, measured silence. Glances replaced greetings. Invitations dried up. Behind the palace walls, her name was whispered, never spoken aloud. The very family she had supported loyally now questioned her loyalty in return. Some called it betrayal, others called it bravery, but for Sophie, who had only ever wanted to honor the Queen's final wishes, the weight of that choice became unbearable. Emotionally, she withered. Those closest to her said she felt blindsided by the backlash. She had never anticipated the fallout would be so personal, so swift. There were even murmurs within the palace press office comparing her treatment to another woman who once dared to speak without permission, Diana. The parallel was never confirmed, never denied. It stung just the same. Sophie hadn't exposed secrets for attention or revenge. She had spoken in reverence, but reverence, it seemed, was only welcome when it served the right narrative. The Queen's legacy, once a beacon of unity, now stood shattered. The brooch had become a dividing line. What was meant as a gesture of continuity had become a symbol of favoritism, ambition, and buried rivalries. The public, once enthralled by the royal mystique, watched now with suspicion. Beatrice, once endearing and overlooked, now appeared as both a victim of the system and a potential threat to it. Sympathy battled scrutiny. Every move she made was dissected, every silence interpreted. Behind the scenes, Camilla grew stronger. Her public face remained steady, gracious, composed. But beneath that, she moved carefully, consolidating influence, drawing lines between loyalty and dissent. Some saw her as asserting control, others as reclaiming order. Either way, her presence expanded just as Sophie's receded. Within the monarchy itself, a new divide emerged, not of rank, but of allegiance. There was the blood, the lineage that could not be denied. And then there was the bond, the quiet, chosen loyalty between the Queen and those she trusted. Sophie had represented the latter, and in revealing the Queen's wishes, she had pitted both sides against each other. Now the House of Windsor trembled, not from scandal, but from something far more dangerous: distrust. The brooch was just a symbol, but symbols carry empires. And in this game of legacy and betrayal, even the smallest sparkle can blind a kingdom. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.